Wyoming Territory, 1875. The sun hung low over the jagged peaks of the Tetons, casting long shadows across the untamed valley below. Dust swirled around the hooves of a chestnut mare as she cantered along the rough trail, her rider scanning the horizon with wary eyes. The frontier made men hard or broke them entirely. There was little room for anything in between. Jackson Prescott had seen 25 winters come and go, and the harsh realities of the West had taught him one immutable truth: a man survived alone. Attachments were dangerous things that gave the world leverage against you. His pa had learned that lesson the hard way when outlaws used Jackson's mother as bait. Both died bloody. Since then, Jackson had kept to himself, hiring on at various ranches, moving when the seasons changed or when folks started getting too familiar. The setting sun glinted off his silver spurs as he guided his mare toward the growing cluster of buildings that made up the town of Sweetwater. His lean frame moved easily with the horse's rhythm, the product of years spent in the saddle. His face, though weathered by wind and sun, retained a youthfulness that belied the hardness in his blue eyes. A light stubble shadowed his strong jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly beneath the brim of his hat. "No point in staying long," he muttered to his horse. "Get supplies, maybe a hot meal, and we'll be on our way." The mare snorted as if in agreement. Jackson had been hired to deliver a herd to Montana Territory, and Sweetwater was merely a waypoint. Just as he preferred it, no roots, no attachments, nothing to lose. He was halfway to the general store when the commotion caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside the schoolhouse, voices raised in anger. Jackson slowed his horse, debating whether to ride on by. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. "This town needs God-fearing folks teaching our children," a red-faced man in a black coat was shouting. "Not some Eastern girl with peculiar ideas." Jackson's curiosity got the better of him. He dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and drifted toward the edge of the crowd. Through the press of bodies, he caught glimpses of a young woman standing on the schoolhouse steps. Her chin was raised defiantly, though he could see her hands trembling at her sides. "Mr. Barnett, I assure you that I am perfectly qualified," she began, her voice clear despite its slight quaver. "Qualification isn't the issue, Miss Goodwin," Barnett interrupted. "It's your suitability. A 20-year-old unmarried woman with your history has no business teaching impressionable children." Jackson found himself moving closer, drawn by something in the young woman's posture, a stubborn dignity despite being badly outnumbered. She was striking, with golden blonde hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet and a simple blue calico dress that couldn't hide her graceful figure. But it was her eyes that caught and held his attention, a vibrant green that flashed with intelligence and spirit. "My history, as you call it, has nothing to do with my abilities as a teacher," she replied firmly. "The school board reviewed my credentials and hired me in good faith." "That was before we knew the whole truth," a woman in the crowd called out. "My Jebediah came home talking about evolution and questioning scripture. I merely presented scientific theories alongside biblical teachings," the schoolteacher explained. "Children should learn to think for themselves." "See there," Barnett pointed accusingly. "That's exactly the problem. Next thing you know, she'll be telling our children that women should vote." The young woman straightened her shoulders. "As a matter of fact, I believe they should." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by angry murmurs. Jackson found himself smiling despite his better judgment. The girl had spirit, that was certain. "Miss Goodwin, this is your final warning," Barnett declared. "Either you teach according to proper Christian principles or you'll be looking for a new position." "I cannot and will not teach children to accept ideas blindly," she answered. "If that means I must leave, then so be it." Barnett's face darkened. "Then consider yourself dismissed. You have until the end of the week to vacate the teacher's quarters." The crowd began to disperse, some looking satisfied, others uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Jackson watched as the young woman's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and she turned to go back into the schoolhouse, dignity intact but clearly shaken. Jackson told himself to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He had supplies to buy and miles to cover before nightfall. Getting involved with a controversial schoolteacher would only complicate his deliberately uncomplicated life. Instead, he found himself approaching the schoolhouse steps. "Miss," he called, removing his hat, "pardon the intrusion, but I couldn't help overhearing." She turned, quickly wiping away a tear. "Have you come to add your objections as well, sir?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No, ma'am," Jackson replied. I just wanted to say that where I come from, standing up for what you believe takes courage. Not many folks have that, man or woman. Surprise registered on her face, followed by a small, grateful smile that did something unexpected to Jackson's chest. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Jackson Prescott. Deborah Goodwin, she replied, offering her hand. As their hands met in a brief handshake, Jackson had the distinct and unsettling feeling that the simple life he'd cultivated was about to become considerably more complicated. You're new to town, she observed, just passing through. That was the plan, he admitted, suddenly uncertain. Deborah studied him for a moment. Well, Mr. Prescott, it seems I'll be passing through myself before long, she gestured toward the departing crowd. This is the third town in 2 years. 3 towns, Jackson couldn't hide his surprise. What exactly is this history they were talking about? A shadow crossed her face. Nothing scandalous, I assure you, just a reputation for unconventional thinking and a tendency to speak my mind. She paused. And a father who died in disgrace after being accused of embezzlement. Was he guilty? Jackson asked bluntly. No, she answered with equal directness. But guilt and innocence matter less than perception out here. You're judged by the company you keep and the name you bear. Jackson nodded slowly. He understood all too well how the past could hang around a person's neck like a millstone. I should get back to work, Deborah said, gesturing toward the schoolhouse. I have lessons to prepare for the children I'm apparently corrupting. Her attempt at humor didn't quite reach her eyes. Jackson replaced his hat. Good day, Miss Goodwin. Good day, Mr. Prescott. As he walked back to his horse, Jackson tried to shake off the encounter. It wasn't his business what happened to Deborah Goodwin. The frontier was hard on everyone, especially women who didn't conform. That wasn't his problem to solve. Yet as he rode toward the general store, his mind kept returning to those green eyes and the quiet dignity with which she'd faced her accusers. By the time he'd finished purchasing supplies, Jackson had convinced himself that his unusual interest was merely concern for basic fairness. Nothing more. That conviction lasted until evening, when he found himself sitting in the town's only restaurant, coincidentally at the precise hour when Deborah Goodwin entered, alone and composed despite the whispers that followed her. The server pointedly ignored her table, and Jackson watched as she sat patiently, her back straight, pretending not to notice the stares or the deliberate snubbing. Something twisted in his gut, a feeling he'd tried to bury along with his parents. Before he could think better of it, he stood and walked to her table. Miss Goodwin, would you care to join me for supper? He asked, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by understanding and then gratitude. That would be lovely, Mr. Prescott. As he escorted her to his table, Jackson caught the disapproving glances from the other diners. For a man who had spent years avoiding attention and entanglements, he'd certainly managed to align himself with the town pariah in record time. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly once they were seated. I know, he replied simply, it won't help your reputation in Sweetwater. Jackson shrugged. I don't plan on staying long enough for that to matter. Ah, she nodded, a hint of disappointment in her expression. You're one of those. One of what? The drifters, the ones who never stay anywhere long enough to be known. She tilted her head slightly. I've met many men like you, Mr. Prescott. Always moving, never settling. There's freedom in movement, he countered. Is there? She met his gaze directly. Or is it just another kind of prison, one without walls but with boundaries nonetheless? Jackson stared at her, disconcerted by her perception. No one had challenged his way of life in years, certainly not so succinctly. You're quite direct for a schoolteacher, he said finally. Perhaps that's why I keep losing teaching positions, she replied with a rueful smile that transformed her face, bringing a warmth to her features that caught Jackson off guard. Their dinner arrived, saving him from having to respond immediately. As they ate, their conversation drifted to safer topics, the changing seasons, the quality of the beef stew, the news from back east. Jackson found himself talking more than he had in months, drawn out by Deborah's genuine interest and thoughtful questions. So you're headed to Montana, she asked as they finished their meal. Yes, ma'am, delivering a herd for the Bar Diamond Ranch. She nodded, seeming to come to some decision. Mr. Prescott, I find myself in need of an escort. Jackson nearly choked on his coffee. Pardon. Not that kind, she said, a blush coloring her cheeks. I meant a traveling companion. I've been offered a teaching position in Helena, and I need to get there by the end of the month. Helena, that's where I'm headed, Jackson said, surprised by the coincidence. I know, that's why I'm asking. She leaned forward slightly. The stage doesn't leave for another week, and frankly, I'd rather not spend that time in Sweetwater. If you're willing, I could compensate you for allowing me to travel with you. It's dangerous country, he warned, and not suited for a lady's comfort. I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Prescott, and I've crossed rougher country than this before. Jackson studied her. The sensible thing would be to refuse. Traveling alone was faster, safer, and fit with his preference for solitude, yet something in her determined expression made him hesitate. What about your belongings, your things from the schoolhouse? I travel light, she said. 2 trunks at most. Jackson sighed, already regretting what he was about to say. We leave at dawn, be ready. Her smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. I promise I won't be a burden. Jackson had the distinct feeling he'd just made a terrible mistake, but watching her face light up with relief and gratitude, he couldn't bring himself to retract the offer. Dawn, he repeated firmly. I won't wait. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat later in the day. Jackson had acquired a sturdy wagon for Deborah's trunks and provisions, hitching it to a reliable draft horse he'd purchased from the livery. He waited by the town's edge, wondering if she would actually appear or if she'd thought better of traveling alone with a man she barely knew. Just as the sun crested the eastern hills, he spotted her walking briskly toward him, dressed in a practical riding skirt and jacket, her golden hair braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat. 2 men followed, carrying her trunks. Good morning, Mr. Prescott, she called cheerfully. I hope I haven't kept you waiting. Right on time, he acknowledged, helping direct the loading of her trunks. As the men departed, he noticed they were the only ones who had come to see her off. No tearful goodbyes, no well-wishers. It struck him as profoundly sad that someone could live in a place and leave without a single person caring. Ready? He asked, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. More than ready, she replied, taking his hand and climbing up with practiced ease. They set off at a steady pace, the town of Sweetwater soon disappearing behind them. Jackson led the way on his mare, occasionally dropping back to check on Deborah, who handled the wagon with surprising skill. You've driven before, he observed during one such check. My father believed women should be self-sufficient, she explained. He taught me to ride, shoot, and drive a team before I was 12. Unusual views for a man of his generation. He was an unusual man, a shadow crossed her face. Brilliant but uncompromising, it didn't win him many friends. Like father, like daughter, Jackson suggested. She laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that made him smile in response. I suppose so, though I'd like to think I'm a bit more diplomatic. After what I saw in town, I'm not convinced, he teased, surprising himself with the ease of their banter. They made good time that first day, stopping by a creek to make camp as the sun began its descent. Jackson busied himself with the horses while Deborah gathered wood for a fire, moving with the confidence of someone who had camped before. As darkness fell and they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of beans and bacon, Jackson found himself watching Deborah covertly. In the firelight, her features were softened, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. There was a quiet strength about her that he found compelling, despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. Why teaching? He asked suddenly. She looked up, considering the question. I believe knowledge is power, she said finally, especially for those who have little else. A good education can change the course of a child's life. Even out here, most of these kids will grow up to be ranchers or farmers, just like their parents. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but even ranchers need to read contracts, calculate profits, understand the wider world. And who knows what some of those children might become, if given the chance to dream beyond their circumstances. Her passion was evident in her voice, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Jackson found himself captivated by her conviction. You really believe that, he said, not a question but a realization. With all my heart, she smiled softly. What about you, Mr. Prescott? What do you believe in? The question caught him off guard. What did he believe in? Survival, self-reliance, keeping to himself. None of those seemed like worthy answers in the face of her idealism. I believe in getting the job done, he said finally, in keeping my word. She studied him thoughtfully. That's admirable, but it's what you do, not what you believe. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. Out here, what you do matters more than what you think. I disagree, she said gently. What we believe shapes every choice we make, whether we acknowledge it or not. He stared into the fire, unwilling to continue a conversation that felt increasingly like she was seeing too much. After a moment of silence, Deborah seemed to sense his reluctance and changed the subject, asking about the trail ahead. That night, as Jackson lay in his bedroll looking up at the stars, he found himself thinking about her question. What did he believe in? Once long ago, he'd believed in family and connection. Then death had taught him the cost of caring, and he'd learned to believe in nothing that could be taken away. Across the dying embers, he could make out Deborah's sleeping form, her breathing deep and regular. She believed in possibilities, in change, in making a difference. Despite everything the world had thrown at her, a father's disgrace, town after town rejecting her, she still fought for her convictions. It was admirable and dangerous. The next 3 days established a rhythm to their journey. They would break camp at dawn, travel until the heat of the day necessitated a rest, then continue until dusk. Deborah proved to be a capable traveler, never complaining about the discomforts of the trail and always doing her share of the camp chores. Their conversations ranged widely, from books they had read to places they had seen. Jackson found himself talking more than he had in years, drawn out by Deborah's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. He learned that she had been educated at a progressive women's college in Massachusetts, that she loved poetry but struggled with mathematics, that she could whistle bird calls with astonishing accuracy. In turn, he shared stories of the places he'd been, the sights he'd seen across the territories. He told her about the time he'd been caught in a buffalo stampede, about the northern lights he'd witnessed in Montana, about the old mountain man who had taught him to track and hunt. What he didn't tell her was why he kept moving, why he never stayed. He didn't mention his parents' deaths or the lesson he'd learned from their loss. Yet sometimes he caught her watching him with those perceptive green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she guessed at the gaps in his stories. On the 4th day, they encountered their first real challenge. A spring storm blew in from the mountains, turning the trail to mud and forcing them to seek shelter. They found it in an abandoned line shack, little more than a one-room cabin with a leaky roof, but it was better than nothing. Quite the palace, Deborah commented wryly as they hurried to get the horses and wagon under the adjacent lean-to. Jackson grinned despite the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Only the finest accommodations for you, Miss Goodwin. They worked together to make the shack habitable, Jackson patching the worst of the roof leaks while Deborah cleared out the dust and debris. By the time they had a fire going in the small stone hearth, the storm was raging in earnest, wind howling around the eaves and rain drumming on the roof. "Looks like we're here for the night," Jackson said, peering out the single small window at the darkening sky. "Maybe longer if this keeps up." Deborah nodded, wringing water from her skirt. "At least we're dry, mostly." Their wet clothing presented a dilemma that Jackson had been trying not to think about. The cabin was small, with no separate rooms for privacy. Propriety demanded they maintain certain boundaries, but practicality insisted they couldn't sit in soaked clothing all night. Deborah solved the problem with characteristic directness. "Mr. Prescott, I suggest we hang our outer garments by the fire to dry. I assure you I am adequately covered beneath, and I promise to look at the wall while you arrange yourself similarly." Jackson felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "That seems sensible," he managed. They worked out an awkward but effective system, taking turns facing the wall while the other removed wet outer layers and hung them near the fire. Jackson kept on his long underwear and undershirt, which were mostly dry, while Deborah remained in her chemise and petticoats. Even with this modest arrangement, the intimate setting made Jackson acutely aware of her presence in a way he hadn't been on the trail. The cabin's single room seemed to shrink as they sat on opposite sides of the fire, each carefully maintaining a respectful distance. "I think this is the part where you're supposed to offer me whiskey from a flask," Deborah said, breaking the tension with a small smile. Jackson chuckled. "Sorry to disappoint, I do have coffee though." "Even better." As they sipped hot coffee, the awkwardness gradually eased. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, a different kind of warmth began to build, one that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the growing comfort between them. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Prescott?" Deborah said after a comfortable silence. "I reckon we've shared a cabin and coffee. You might as well call me Jackson." She smiled. "Very well, Jackson. And you may call me Deborah. What did you want to ask?" She hesitated, then looked directly at him. "Why do you keep moving? What are you running from?" The blunt question took him by surprise. "What makes you think I'm running?" "Experience," she said simply. I recognize the signs, the way you never mention family or home, the ease with which you travel light, the reluctance to form attachments. Jackson stared into his coffee cup, debating how much to reveal. He'd spent so long keeping his past locked away that sharing it felt like removing armor before battle, dangerous and exposing. My parents were killed when I was 15, he said finally, the words feeling rusty from disuse. My father owned a small ranch in Colorado. Some men wanted the land and they used my mother to draw him out. By the time I got back from town, both were dead. Deborah's face showed compassion without pity. I'm so sorry. It taught me something important, Jackson continued, his voice hardening. Caring about people makes you vulnerable. The more you love, the more you have to lose. So you chose to love nothing and no one, she said softly. I chose to survive. There's a difference between surviving and living, Jackson. He met her gaze across the fire. Is there, tell me, Deborah, has caring about your principles, your students, your reputation made your life easier or harder? Harder, she admitted without hesitation. But also infinitely more worthwhile. Even when it gets you run out of town after town. Even then, she leaned forward slightly, the alternative is to compromise what I believe to make others comfortable. To teach only what parents want to hear, not what children need to learn. I can't do that and still respect myself. Her conviction was humbling and irritating in equal measure. That's fine for you, he said, more gruffly than he intended, but I've seen what happens when you let yourself care too much. So have I, she countered. My father killed himself after he was accused of theft. He couldn't bear the shame, the loss of reputation. I found him. Her voice wavered slightly before steadying. I could have hidden away after that, changed my name, denied him. Instead, I chose to live openly, to carry his name proudly because I know he was innocent. Jackson was stunned by her revelation. That takes courage. Or stubbornness, she said with a sad smile. The point is, we've both seen the worst that life can offer. You chose one path, I chose another. But don't think for a moment that I don't understand the temptation to run, to protect yourself from further pain. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared experience despite different responses. Jackson felt a wall inside him tremble, not falling but weakening nonetheless. We should get some sleep, he said, unwilling to continue a conversation that was venturing into territory he'd avoided for years. Deborah nodded, accepting his retreat. Good night, Jackson. Good night, Deborah. As he lay in his bedroll, listening to the rain and her soft breathing from across the small room, Jackson realized with a jolt of alarm that Deborah Goodwin had somehow slipped past his carefully constructed defenses. In just a few days, she had become more than a traveling companion. She had become someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to him. The realization was not welcome. The storm passed by morning but left the trails muddy and treacherous. They lost half a day waiting for the ground to firm up enough for safe travel, and when they did set out, progress was frustratingly slow. Jackson found himself watching Deborah with new awareness, noticing the graceful curve of her neck as she guided the wagon, the way sunlight caught in her hair, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Each observation was a danger sign he couldn't ignore. He responded by pulling back, keeping conversations brief and impersonal. If Deborah noticed the change, she didn't comment on it directly, though he occasionally caught her studying him with a puzzled expression. Their slow progress meant they needed to replenish supplies sooner than planned. They diverted to a small settlement called Cottonwood, crossing late on the 6th day of their journey, arriving just before the general store closed. We'll stay at the boarding house tonight, Jackson decided, looking at the darkening sky. Get an early start tomorrow. Deborah agreed, though she seemed distracted as they arranged accommodations, separate rooms, of course, and secured stabling for their animals. It wasn't until they were seated in the settlement's modest dining room that he understood why. You've been here before, he observed, noting how her eyes kept darting to the other diners, her posture tense. She nodded slightly. 2 years ago, I taught here for a semester. Another town that didn't appreciate your methods. A rueful smile touched her lips, something like that. Before she could elaborate, a middle-aged couple approached their table. The woman's face was tight with disapproval, the man's merely curious. Well, if it isn't Miss Goodwin, the woman said, her voice carrying enough to turn heads nearby. I never expected to see you back in Cottonwood. Deborah straightened her shoulders. Mrs. Foster, Mr. Foster, how nice to see you again. Is it? Mrs. Foster's tone made it clear the feeling wasn't mutual. I'm surprised you'd show your face here after what happened." Jackson tensed, not liking the woman's tone or the way Deborah had gone pale. "Evening, folks," he said pointedly. "We're just having a quiet supper." Mrs. Foster looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "And who might you be?" "Jackson Prescott. Miss Goodwin and I are traveling to Helena." Together, Mrs. Foster's eyebrows rose suggestively. "Well, I suppose that explains a great deal about her character." Anger flared in Jackson's chest. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to watch your words carefully." "It's all right, Jackson," Deborah said softly. She turned to the Fosters. "Mr. Prescott is escorting me to my new teaching position. Our relationship is entirely proper." "Mr. Foster, who had remained silent, placed a hand on his wife's arm. "Come along, Harriet, it's none of our business." Mrs. Foster sniffed but allowed herself to be led away, though not before stage whispering loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Can you imagine her teaching children again, after what she did to poor Thomas? Jackson watched Deborah's face carefully as the couple departed. "Who's Thomas?" "Their son," she answered, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "He was 17 when I taught here, brilliant, especially in sciences. I encouraged him to apply to university back east. Let me guess, they didn't approve. They wanted him to take over the family store." Deborah pushed her food around her plate. "He left anyway. They blamed me for putting ideas in his head." "Did you?" She met his eyes directly. "Yes, I told him he had gifts that shouldn't be wasted, that he could do more, be more." "Was that wrong?" The vulnerability in her question touched something in Jackson. "No," he said firmly. "It wasn't wrong, hard on his parents maybe, but not wrong." Relief softened her features. "Thank you for that. Sometimes I wonder if they're right, if I do more harm than good with my peculiar ideas. The way I see it, you gave him choices. What he did with them was up to him." Jackson surprised himself with his defense of her actions. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, too aware of the curious glances from other diners to continue the conversation comfortably. As they walked back to the boarding house, Jackson found himself walking closer to Deborah than strictly necessary, as if his proximity could shield her from the whispers that followed them. At her door she paused. "Thank you for defending me tonight." "I didn't say anything that wasn't true." She studied his face in the dim hallway light. "You're a good man, Jackson Prescott, even if you try to hide it beneath that gruff exterior." Before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then slipped into her room with a soft good night. Jackson stood frozen in the hallway, his cheek burning where her lips had touched it. Something was happening to him, something he'd spent a decade avoiding. He was starting to care about Deborah Goodwin, not just as a traveling companion but as a woman, brave, principled, and undeniably beautiful. The realization should have sent him running. Instead, he found himself standing outside her door, wondering what it would be like to kiss her properly, to hold her close, to let himself feel something other than cautious detachment. Dangerous thoughts, foolish thoughts. With an effort, he turned away and went to his own room, determined to reinforce the emotional walls he'd built so carefully. They still had at least a week of travel ahead, and then their paths would diverge. She would become a teacher in Helena, and he would move on as he always did. That was the safest course, the only course, so why did it suddenly feel so hollow? They left Cottonwood Crossing at first light, both eager to put the uncomfortable encounter behind them. The weather held fair, allowing them to make good time as they followed the winding trail northward through increasingly rugged country. On their 8th day of travel, they entered a narrow valley flanked by steep, pine-covered slopes. The beauty of the landscape provided a welcome distraction from the growing tension between them, a tension Jackson couldn't entirely attribute to Deborah's innocent kiss. "There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead," he said, consulting his map. "We can rest the horses there and—" A sharp crack echoed through the valley, cutting off his words. Jackson recognized the sound instantly, rifle fire, and reacted without thinking. He spurred his horse toward Deborah, reached out, and hauled her from the wagon seat just as another shot splintered the wood where she had been sitting. They tumbled to the ground behind the wagon, Jackson's body shielding hers as more shots rang out. "Raiders," Deborah gasped, remarkably composed despite the danger. Jackson peered around the wagon wheel, trying to locate the shooter. "I don't think so." "The shots are coming from one position." He spotted movement on the ridge to their left. "There, lone rifleman on that outcropping." "Why would someone be shooting at us?" Her voice was steady, though he could feel her heart racing where their bodies pressed together. Don't know, stay down. Jackson reached for his rifle, secured in its scabbard on his saddle. His mare, well-trained, had stopped nearby when the shooting started. Another shot kicked up dirt by the wagon wheel. He's not a very good shot, Deborah observed. Lucky for us. Jackson checked his rifle, then glanced at Deborah. I need to circle around behind him. You stay with the wagon. No, she said firmly. I'm coming with you. Deborah. I can shoot Jackson, and I'd rather not be alone if he has friends nearby. He hesitated, then nodded. Stay close and do exactly as I say. They crawled to where the horses waited, keeping the wagon between them and the shooter. Using the trees for cover, they made their way up the slope, circling wide to approach the rifleman from behind. The climb was steep and difficult, but Deborah kept pace without complaint, moving with surprising stealth through the underbrush. They caught glimpses of their attacker occasionally, a solitary figure in a worn coat still focused on the wagon below. When they were about 50 yards behind him, Jackson signaled for Deborah to wait. He crept forward alone, rifle ready, until he had a clear view of the shooter. Drop the rifle, he called sharply, hands where I can see them. The man startled and spun around, nearly losing his balance on the narrow outcropping. Jackson's stomach dropped as he got his first clear look at their attacker. It was barely more than a boy, perhaps 16, with a gaunt face and wild eyes. Stay back, the youth shouted, his voice cracking as he swung his rifle toward Jackson. Easy now, Jackson said, keeping his voice level despite the rifle pointed at his chest. Just put the gun down and we'll talk. Can't do that, the boy replied, his hands shaking visibly. Need your horses, need your supplies. Understanding dawned. This wasn't a hardened outlaw, just a desperate kid, probably on the run and out of options. Nobody needs to get hurt here, Jackson said, not lowering his own rifle but not firing either. You're in a bad spot, I can see that, but this isn't the way. The boy's face contorted. Don't have a choice. They'll catch me if I don't. Who'll catch you? Deborah's voice came from behind Jackson. He suppressed a flash of irritation at her for not staying put as instructed. The boy's eyes widened as she stepped into view. Who are you? Someone who doesn't want to see you make a terrible mistake, she answered calmly. What's your name? Don't matter, he muttered, but the rifle barrel dipped slightly. It matters to me, Deborah insisted. I'm Deborah Goodwin. This is Jackson Prescott. We're headed to Helena. The boy's eyes darted between them, confusion evident in his expression. People running for their lives didn't typically stop to introduce themselves. Sam, he finally said. Sam Miller. Well, Sam, Deborah continued in the same gentle tone she might use with a skittish horse, why don't you put down the rifle so we can talk properly? We might be able to help. You can't help me, Sam insisted, though with less conviction. Nobody can. You won't know unless you try, she countered, and shooting at strangers certainly won't improve your situation. Sam hesitated, the internal struggle visible on his young face. Finally, slowly, he lowered the rifle. That's good, Jackson said, keeping his own weapon ready but adopting Deborah's calm approach. Now, what kind of trouble are you in, son? The story spilled out haltingly. Sam had been working at a ranch 20 miles back, where the foreman had been systematically cheating the hands out of their wages. When Sam confronted him, a fight ensued and the foreman ended up with a broken arm. Now the local sheriff, the foreman's cousin, was after Sam for assault. Didn't mean to hurt him that bad, Sam finished miserably. But he came at me first and I just pushed him. He fell wrong. Jackson and Deborah exchanged glances. The boy's story had the ring of truth, and his attempted ambush suddenly made sense, a panicked, desperate act by someone with no good options. When did you last eat? Deborah asked, noticing the boy's hollow cheeks. Sam shrugged. Couple days ago, maybe. Come down to our camp, she decided. We have food to spare. Deborah, Jackson cautioned quietly. She met his eyes steadily. He's just a boy, Jackson, a hungry, frightened boy who made a mistake. Jackson sighed, knowing she was right but concerned nonetheless. Fine, but I'll keep the rifle for now. He held out his hand to Sam. After a moment's hesitation, the boy handed over his weapon. They made camp early that day, in a sheltered spot away from the trail. While Jackson kept a wary eye on their unexpected guest, Deborah prepared a hearty meal that Sam devoured with the single-minded focus of the truly hungry. As the tension gradually eased, Jackson found himself reluctantly impressed by how Deborah handled the situation. She neither condemned Sam for his actions nor excused them, instead listening attentively and asking thoughtful questions about his background and aspirations. I always wanted to learn a trade, Sam admitted as evening fell and they sat around the fire. Blacksmithing, maybe, but Pa died when I was 12 and Ma couldn't manage alone. Been working ranch jobs since then, sending what I can back home. You have a good mind, Sam, Deborah observed. It's not too late for an apprenticeship. Sam snorted, who'd take me now? I'll be lucky if I don't end up in jail. Helena has several fine blacksmiths, she said. And it's far enough from here that your misunderstanding needn't follow you. Jackson raised an eyebrow at her. Are you suggesting we take him with us? Why not? Deborah challenged. He needs a fresh start, and we could use another pair of hands for the journey. He shot at us, Jackson reminded her, though without much heat. The boy's story had affected him more than he cared to admit. Poor judgment born of desperation, she countered, something I suspect you can understand. The pointed remark hit closer to home than Jackson liked. He had made his own questionable decisions in the aftermath of his parents' deaths, some that might have ended badly if not for the intervention of a few good people who saw past his anger to the hurt beneath. It's not my decision to make, he said finally, but if he wants to come along as far as Helena, I won't object. Sam looked between them, hope and wariness warring in his expression. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Sometimes people deserve a second chance, Deborah said simply. She glanced at Jackson. Sometimes they need someone who sees what they could be, not just what they've done. The weight of her gaze made Jackson uncomfortable, as if she were speaking about him as much as Sam. He busied himself banking the fire for the night, avoiding her knowing eyes. That night, as he took the first watch while the others slept, Jackson found himself reflecting on Deborah's words. She had an uncanny ability to see through people's defenses, to recognize the wounds they carried beneath their carefully constructed facades. It made her dangerous to someone like him, someone whose survival depended on keeping others at a distance. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, not just physical attraction, though that was certainly present, but something deeper. A recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps. Someone who had faced loss and hardship, but made different choices than he had. Across the dying embers, he watched her sleeping form, her face peaceful in repose. What would it be like, he wondered, to wake up beside her each morning, to build a life with someone who challenged him, who saw the man he could be rather than the one he had become? Dangerous thoughts, thoughts that led to vulnerability, to risk, to love. The word came unbidden, shocking in its clarity. With a muttered curse, Jackson stood and walked to the edge of their small camp, needing distance from the sleeping woman who had somehow slipped past every defense he'd built over the years. He couldn't love her, wouldn't love her. In a few days they would reach Helena and their paths would diverge. She would take up her teaching position, perhaps help Sam find his apprenticeship, and Jackson would continue on alone as he always had. That was the plan, the safe, sensible plan that protected him from the pain of loss. So why did it suddenly feel like the greatest risk of all? The addition of Sam to their party changed the dynamic of their journey in unexpected ways. The boy's presence provided a buffer between Jackson and Deborah, diluting the growing tension between them. Yet it also gave Jackson an opportunity to observe Deborah in a new light, as a mentor and guide to a troubled young man. She was a natural teacher, he realized, watching her draw Sam out of his shell with patient questions and genuine interest. By their second day together, the boy was eagerly discussing books he had read, sharing dreams he had clearly told no one else, absorbing Deborah's encouragement like parched earth soaking up rain. You're good with him, Jackson commented that evening as they prepared supper while Sam tended the horses. Deborah smiled, the simple compliment clearly pleasing her. He reminds me of many boys I've taught, bright but constrained by circumstances. With the right opportunities, he could go far. You really believe that, don't you? That education can change lives. I know it can, she said firmly. It changed mine. After my father died, books were my refuge, learning my salvation. Without education, I would have had no options beyond marriage or servitude. Some would say those are the only proper options for a woman, Jackson observed, playing devil's advocate. Fire flashed in her green eyes. Some would be wrong. Women are capable of so much more if given the chance. She paused, studying him. Do you truly believe a woman's place is only in the home? No, he admitted. My mother ran our ranch as much as my father did. They were partners in every sense. They sound like remarkable people. They were. The familiar pang of loss was there, but somehow less sharp than usual. They would have liked you. The words slipped out before he could stop them, revealing more than he intended. Deborah's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm gently. I would have liked to meet them, she said quietly. For a dangerous moment, Jackson thought about covering her hand with his own, about drawing her closer, about giving voice to the feelings growing inside him despite his best efforts to suppress them. Sam's return saved him from the impulse. The moment passed, but the warmth of her touch lingered, a silent promise, or perhaps a warning, of what could be if he only had the courage to reach for it. Their journey continued northward, the landscape growing more dramatic as they approached the mountains that marked the border between Wyoming and Montana territories. Spring was giving way to early summer, bringing longer days and milder nights that made their travel easier. On their 11th day together, they crested a ridge to find a stunning valley spread before them, a ribbon of river winding through lush grasslands dotted with wildflowers. It's beautiful, Deborah breathed, reining in the wagon to admire the view. Good grazing land, Jackson agreed, his cattleman's eye assessing the rich grass. Whoever owns this valley has a fine spread. They made their way down into the valley, following the trail that ran alongside the river. Around midday, they spotted a ranch house in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney. Might be worth stopping to ask about the trail ahead, Jackson suggested. Could be there's a better route than the one we're planning. As they approached the ranch, they saw a woman hanging laundry in the yard. She looked up at their arrival, shading her eyes against the sun. Jackson estimated her age at around 40, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Afternoon, ma'am, he called, reining in his horse at a respectful distance. Afternoon, she replied cautiously, her gaze taking in the three travelers. Hope you don't mind us stopping by, Jackson continued. We're headed to Helena and thought you might have advice about the trail ahead. The woman's posture relaxed slightly. Helena is it? You're on the right track, though there's a creek crossing about 10 miles north that can be tricky this time of year. She wiped her hands on her apron. I'm Martha Wilson. My husband's out with the herd, but he should be back before sundown. Jackson Prescott, ma'am, this is Miss Deborah Goodwin and Sam Miller. Martha's gaze lingered on Deborah, noting her genteel appearance despite the dust of travel. You folks look like you could use a proper meal and a rest. Why don't you water your horses and come inside? I've got stew on the stove. The invitation, unexpected but welcome, was quickly accepted. As they settled around the Wilsons' sturdy table, the conversation flowed easily, with Martha proving to be as hospitable as she was practical. So you're to be a teacher in Helena? She asked Deborah after hearing their story, a judiciously edited version that presented Sam as Deborah's young cousin rather than a fugitive. Yes, at the new school they're establishing there. A fine profession, Martha nodded approvingly. We could use a teacher hereabouts. The nearest school's a full day's ride away. Do you have children? Deborah inquired. A shadow crossed Martha's face. Had two, lost our boy to scarlet fever 3 years back. Our daughter married last fall and moved to Oregon. I'm sorry about your son, Deborah said quietly. Martha acknowledged the sympathy with a nod. Life out here is hard. You take the joys when they come and bear the sorrows as best you can. She glanced at Jackson. And you, Mr. Prescott, what takes you to Helena? Just delivering a herd, he explained. I'm helping Miss Goodwin get there safely along the way. Just passing through then, there was something knowing in Martha's gaze as it moved between him and Deborah. Yes, ma'am, the answer felt hollow on his tongue. Shame, Martha commented. Good men are scarce in these parts. Before Jackson could respond to the pointed remark, the sound of horses outside announced the return of Martha's husband. Robert Wilson proved to be as welcoming as his wife, insisting their guests stay the night rather than continue their journey so late in the day. Been a while since we had company, he explained, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Does a body good to hear new voices and stories. Their hospitality was genuine and generous, clean beds in the small bunkhouse for Jackson and Sam, the spare bedroom for Deborah. After a hearty supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Beautiful country you have here, Jackson remarked to Robert. The older man nodded, puffing contentedly on his pipe. It is that. Came out here 15 years ago with nothing but Martha, 2 small children, and a dream. Been building it ever since. He gestured toward the distant hills. Got 500 acres and 100 head of cattle now. Not the biggest spread, but it's ours. You've done well for yourselves, Jackson said sincerely. Couldn't have done it without Martha, Robert said, glancing affectionately at his wife. Takes a special kind of woman to thrive out here. Jackson's gaze involuntarily shifted to where Deborah sat talking with Martha, her face animated in the fading light. She had adapted to the rigors of their journey with grace and courage, never complaining about discomforts that would have sent many Eastern ladies into fits of despair. Yes, he agreed softly. It does. Later, as the women washed the dishes and Sam helped Robert with some final chores, Jackson found himself alone on the porch, contemplating the peaceful scene before him. The ranch house was modest but well built, the yard neat, the outbuildings solid. It spoke of years of hard work, of dreams realized through persistence and partnership. For the first time in a decade, he allowed himself to imagine a different life than the one he'd chosen. A home, a wife, perhaps children someday, not constant movement but roots deep in good soil, not isolation but connection. The screen door creaked and Deborah stepped out onto the porch. "Beautiful evening," she commented, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "It is," he agreed, acutely aware of her presence, of the scent of soap, and something uniquely her that even days on the trail hadn't diminished. "They seem happy, don't they, despite their losses?" Jackson nodded. "They've built something real together." "It makes me wonder," Deborah began, then hesitated. "Wonder what?" She turned to face him, her expression earnest in the twilight. "If perhaps the greatest courage isn't facing danger or hardship, but opening oneself to possibility, to joy even knowing it might end in sorrow." Her words struck at the heart of the fear he'd carried for so long, that loving meant inevitable loss, that caring was a weakness he couldn't afford. "Some would call that foolishness, not courage," he said, his voice rough. "And what do you call it, Jackson?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the unspoken feelings that had grown during their journey together. Jackson found himself at a crossroads, one path leading back to the safety of emotional isolation, the other toward something both terrifying and exhilarating. Before he could answer, Robert's voice called from the barn, asking for help with a stubborn gate latch. The moment broke and Jackson stepped back, both relieved and disappointed. "We should get some rest," he said. "Long day tomorrow." Deborah studied him for a moment, something like resignation in her eyes. "Yes, I suppose we should." She turned to go inside, then paused. "Good night, Jackson." "Good night, Deborah." As he watched her disappear into the house, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he had just missed something important, a chance to change the course of his life with a few simple words. The realization left him unsettled, restless with possibilities and regrets. They left the Wilson Ranch the next morning after a hearty breakfast and profuse thanks for the hospitality. Martha pressed a bundle of freshly baked bread and preserves on them, while Robert provided detailed advice about the trail ahead, including the tricky creek crossing he'd mentioned. "Should reach Helena in 3 days if the weather holds," Robert estimated, "though there's talk of a storm coming in from the mountains." The sky was clear as they set out, but by mid-afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon. Jackson eyed them warily, calculating distances and options. "We might need to find shelter before we reach that creek crossing," he told Deborah and Sam as they paused to rest the horses. "That storm looks mean." "There's a line of bluffs about 5 miles ahead," Sam pointed out, studying the map Robert had marked for them. "Might be caves or at least some windbreaks." Jackson nodded, impressed by the boy's practical thinking. "Good eye, Sam, let's push on and see what we can find before that storm hits." They made good time, reaching the bluffs just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Fortune favored them. A shallow cave provided perfect shelter, deep enough to accommodate them and their animals but not so deep as to potentially house predators. They worked quickly to set up camp, securing the horses and wagon before the worst of the storm hit. By the time they had a small fire going near the cave mouth, the storm had unleashed its fury, sheets of rain obscuring the view beyond the entrance, lightning forking across the darkened sky. "Quite a show," Deborah commented, watching nature's display from their dry vantage point. Jackson nodded, checking that their supplies were properly secured, likely to last the night. "We'll need to keep watch to make sure the creek doesn't flood before we can cross." Sam volunteered for the first watch, positioning himself near the cave entrance where he could monitor both the storm and their surroundings. Jackson and Deborah settled deeper inside, where the fire provided warmth against the damp chill that had accompanied the storm. "We've been lucky with the weather until now," Deborah observed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Luck had little to do with it," Jackson replied. "We planned well, chose our route carefully." She smiled at that, Are you always so reluctant to acknowledge good fortune, Mr. Prescott? I prefer to rely on preparation rather than chance, Miss Goodwin, he countered, a smile tugging at his own lips despite his attempt at seriousness. And yet here we are, sheltered perfectly just when we needed it most. Call it preparation if you like, but I choose to see the hand of Providence. Their gentle debate continued as the storm raged outside, the easy banter a comfortable rhythm they'd developed over their days together. Yet beneath it ran a current of awareness, of time slipping away. Helena was less than 3 days' journey now, and with it, the end of their shared path. The thought sent an unexpected pang through Jackson's chest. He had grown accustomed to Deborah's presence, her quick mind, her compassion, her quiet strength. The prospect of continuing on alone after they reached Helena felt suddenly, inexplicably hollow. When Sam yawned conspicuously for the third time, Jackson sent him to get some sleep, taking over the watch. As the boy settled into his bedroll, Jackson moved to sit near the cave entrance, where he could keep an eye on both the weather and their small camp. To his surprise, Deborah joined him, bringing her blanket and a cup of coffee. "You should rest," he told her. "No need for both of us to keep watch." "I'm not tired," she replied, settling beside him. "And I've always loved storms, the raw power of them, the reminder of how small we are in the face of nature." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the lightning illuminate the landscape in brief, dramatic flashes. The steady drumming of rain created a cocoon of sound that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world, a private moment stolen from time itself. "May I ask you something, Jackson?" Deborah said finally, her voice soft against the backdrop of the storm. "You can ask," he replied, wary of the seriousness in her tone. She turned to face him, her features outlined in the firelight. "What will you do after Helena, after you deliver your herd?" The question was simple enough, but the answer far more complicated than it should have been. A week ago he would have said he'd find another job, another trail, another temporary place. Now he wasn't so certain. "I haven't decided," he said honestly. "Will you keep moving?" "Never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." He studied her face, wondering at the purpose behind her questions. "That's been my way for a long time." "Has it made you happy?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Had it made him happy, he had been content perhaps, safe certainly, but happy. "I haven't thought about happiness much," he admitted. "Survival has been enough." And now, her eyes held his, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Jackson felt himself standing at another crossroads, knowing his answer would set a course that could not easily be changed. "Now," he said slowly, "I find myself wondering if there might be more." Something flickered in her expression, hope perhaps, or relief. "More than survival, you mean?" Yes, the admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating at once. Deborah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his palm. "There is, Jackson, so much more." The simple touch sent a current through him more powerful than the lightning outside. Without conscious thought, his fingers closed around hers, a connection that felt both fragile and unbreakable. "Deborah," he began, uncertain what he meant to say but knowing he needed to say something. A tremendous crash of thunder drowned out his words, followed by a sound that had them both on their feet instantly, the rush of water, sudden and violent. "The creek," Jackson grabbed his slicker. "It's flooding. We need to check how bad it is." Sam stirred at the commotion, sitting up groggily. "What's happening?" "Flash flood," Jackson explained tersely. "Stay with Deborah, I'm going to scout the creek crossing." "Not alone," Deborah insisted, already pulling on her own coat. "Sam can watch the camp and animals." Jackson wanted to argue but knew that look of determination by now. "Stay close," he conceded. They ventured out into the storm, the rain lashing at them as they made their way toward the creek a quarter-mile away. The normally placid stream had transformed into a raging torrent, water churning brown and violent between its banks. "It's worse than I thought," Jackson shouted over the storm, holding onto Deborah's arm to steady her on the slick ground. "The crossing will be impassable until this subsides." As they turned to head back to the cave, a new sound reached them, the splintering crack of wood giving way. Upstream, a logjam that had been damming part of the creek suddenly broke apart, sending a wall of water and debris surging downstream. "Run!" Jackson grabbed Deborah's hand, pulling her toward higher ground as the flood rushed toward them. They scrambled up the muddy slope, the water rising with terrifying speed behind them. Just as they reached what seemed like a safe height, the ground beneath Deborah's feet gave way. She slipped, a cry of alarm escaping her as she began to slide toward the churning water. Jackson lunged, catching her wrist before she could fall into the flood. For one heart-stopping moment, he feared his grip would slip on her rain-slick skin. Then his fingers locked around her arm and he was pulling her up beside him, both of them gasping with exertion and fear. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his hands moving over her arms, her face checking for injuries. "Yes," she breathed, trembling but unhurt, "thanks to you." The relief that washed through Jackson was so intense it left him light-headed. The realization of how close he'd come to losing her, this woman who had somehow become essential to him, hit with the force of a physical blow. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him as if to reassure himself of her safety. She clung to him just as fiercely, her face buried in his shoulder. "I thought," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she whispered, "I know." When he drew back slightly to look at her face, rain mingling with tears on her cheeks, Jackson knew there was no going back. No more pretending that what he felt for Deborah Goodwin was merely friendship or temporary companionship. He lowered his mouth to hers, a question in the gentle pressure of his lips. Her answer came immediately as she rose on tiptoe, her arms tightening around his neck, her lips parting beneath his. The kiss deepened, desperation giving way to tenderness, and then to heat, a culmination of feelings that had been building since that first meeting outside the Sweetwater schoolhouse. The storm raged around them, but neither noticed, lost in a different kind of tempest, one that had been brewing between them for days. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "We should get back to the cave," he said, though he made no move to release her. Deborah nodded, her fingers still curled in the wet fabric of his coat. "Yes, we should." They made their way back hand in hand, the danger of the flood behind them, but a new, more personal risk ahead, the risk of opening their hearts after years of careful guardianship. Sam's relief at their safe return was evident, though he raised a questioning eyebrow at their clasped hands and the way they remained close even after entering the relative warmth of the cave. If he suspected the change in their relationship, he had the tact not to comment directly. As the night deepened and the storm gradually subsided, Jackson kept watch, his thoughts in turmoil. He had kissed Deborah more than kissed her, he had revealed feelings he'd sworn never to acknowledge. There was no taking that back, no pretending it hadn't happened. The question now was, what came next? Helena was still their destination. Deborah still had her teaching position waiting. His herd still needed delivery, nothing external had changed, but everything else had. Across the cave, Deborah slept peacefully, her face softened in repose. Looking at her, Jackson knew he faced the most important decision of his life since that day 10 years ago when he buried his parents and vowed never to be vulnerable again. He could retreat to safety, finish this journey, and continue his solitary existence. Or he could take the greatest risk of all, opening his heart fully to this remarkable woman, building a life that included love despite its inherent dangers. As dawn broke, casting pale light into their shelter, Jackson realized he had already made his choice. He had made it the moment he kissed her, perhaps even before, when he first defended her in Sweetwater, or when he agreed to escort her to Helena. Some decisions, it seemed, the heart made long before the mind caught up. The morning after the storm dawned clear and brilliant, the world washed clean by the night's tempest. They emerged from their cave shelter to find the creek still swollen, but no longer the raging torrent of the previous night. "We'll need to wait for the water to recede before we can cross safely," Jackson announced after scouting the area. "Probably tomorrow morning at the earliest." Neither Deborah nor Sam seemed particularly distressed by the delay. They spent the day pleasantly enough, drying out their belongings, replenishing their supplies with fish Sam caught in a quiet pool, and enjoying the unexpected respite from travel. Throughout the day, Jackson found his gaze returning to Deborah again and again, still hardly believing the change between them. They hadn't spoken directly about the kiss or what it meant, but something fundamental had shifted. Small touches, lingering glances, a new ease in their interactions that spoke of boundaries crossed and new territory explored. As evening approached, Sam volunteered to check on the creek again, a transparent excuse that left Jackson and Deborah alone by the fire. "Subtle, isn't he?" Deborah remarked with a smile as the boy disappeared down the trail. "About as subtle as a stampeding buffalo," Jackson agreed, moving to sit beside her on a fallen log. "Smart kid, though." "Yes, he is." She looked toward where Sam had vanished. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Helena." "So have I," Jackson admitted, his heart quickening. This was it, the conversation that would determine their future. Deborah turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious in the fading light. I meant what I said last night, Jackson. There is more to life than survival. There can be joy, connection, love, even in a place as harsh as the frontier. I'm beginning to believe that, he said quietly, because of you. Her expression softened. What are you saying? Jackson took a deep breath, stepping off the cliff of certainty into the unknown. I'm saying that I don't want to keep running. That meeting you has changed something in me I thought was permanently broken. He reached for her hand, needing the connection. I'm saying that I care for you, Deborah Goodwin, more than I've allowed myself to care for anyone in a very long time. Her fingers tightened around his. And Helena, what happens when we get there? That depends, he said, his voice rough with emotion. On what you want. What I want, a smile trembled on her lips. I want a man who sees me for who I am, principles, opinions, and all, and values me for it, not despite it. I want someone who understands that teaching isn't just a job for me but a calling. Her free hand rose to touch his face gently. I want you, Jackson. The simple declaration undid him completely. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. She responded with equal fervor, her body melting against his as if she had finally found her home. When they broke apart, breathless and smiling, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. The fear of loss that had defined him for so long seemed distant and insignificant compared to the joy of holding Deborah in his arms. I'll find work in Helena, he said, already planning. Deliver this herd, then look for something permanent. There's bound to be a ranch that needs a foreman or land I could buy eventually. Deborah's smile widened. Actually, I may have a suggestion about that. Lo? The school board mentioned they've been trying to establish a small demonstration farm to teach the children practical agricultural skills alongside their book learning. They need someone knowledgeable to run it. Jackson raised an eyebrow. And you think I'd be suitable? I think you'd be perfect, she said sincerely. You know cattle, crops, the land itself. You're patient with Sam, which suggests you'd be good with other young people. She hesitated, and it would mean we'd be working together. The prospect was appealing in ways Jackson hadn't anticipated. Not just being near Deborah, but using his skills to teach the next generation, to build something lasting rather than always moving on to the next temporary job. I'd like that, he said simply. Her expression became serious again. There's something else we need to discuss, Jackson, something important. What is it? Children, my own, I mean, someday. She met his eyes directly. I want a family eventually. Not immediately, but in time. I need to know if that's something you could want too. The question touched on fears Jackson had carried for years, the fear of creating new vulnerabilities, new ways to be hurt. But looking at Deborah, he realized that some risks were worth taking, that a life without such connections was no real life at all. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. With you, yes. The joy that lit her face was worth every moment of fear, every doubt he'd ever harbored. She kissed him again, a seal on promises spoken and unspoken. When Sam returned from his errand, he found them sitting close together, hands entwined, plans for a shared future taking shape between them. His knowing grin suggested he'd anticipated this outcome long before either of them had admitted it to themselves. The creek had receded enough by the following morning to allow safe crossing. They resumed their journey toward Helena with renewed purpose, the landscape growing more familiar to Jackson as they neared their destination. They reached the outskirts of the growing city 2 days later, the late afternoon sun glinting off distant rooftops as they crested the final hill. There it is, Jackson said, reining in his horse to allow Deborah and Sam to draw alongside. Helena. For a moment they sat in silence, each contemplating what awaited them. For Deborah, a new position and the chance to teach without prejudice. For Sam, the possibility of an apprenticeship and a fresh start. For Jackson, a complete transformation from lone drifter to settled man with ties to both a place and a person. Nervous, he asked Deborah. She smiled, reaching across the space between them to take his hand. No. Not with you beside me. Sam cleared his throat awkwardly. If you two are going to get all mushy again, I could ride ahead and give you some privacy. Jackson laughed, the sound free and unencumbered in a way it hadn't been in years. Stay where you are, kid. We're all going into Helena together. As they made their final approach to the city, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical miles from Sweetwater to Helena, but the emotional distance he had traveled from isolation to connection. He had promised, in actions if not words, to love a woman that others had rejected for her principles and forthright nature. In doing so, he had found not just love but redemption from the prison of fear he'd built around his heart. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to protect himself from loss by avoiding attachments, he had lost the chance for the very things that made life worth living: love, family, purpose beyond mere survival. "A penny for your thoughts," Deborah said softly as they rode side by side down the main street of Helena. Jackson smiled at her, this remarkable woman who had changed everything. "I was just thinking that some promises are worth the risk of making," he said, "and some chances are worth taking, no matter how frightening they might seem." "Like the chance you took on me?" she asked, her eyes bright with understanding. "The best chance I ever took," he confirmed. "And one I intend to keep taking every day for the rest of my life." As the sun set over the mountains, casting golden light across the bustling frontier town, Jackson Prescott knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found what he'd been running from all these years: not loss or pain, but the courage to embrace life in all its messy, beautiful fullness, with Deborah Goodwin by his side.